They laid the photographs on the steel table. 15 body bags lined up on the deck of a salvage ship. 15 men I trained, ate with, and lived beside at the bottom of the ocean. The corporation's lawyers wouldn't look at my face. They just stared at the time-stamped reports I'd submitted weeks before the collapse. Reports they swore under oath never existed. I didn't cry. I just pulled the microphone closer and started talking. The fluorescent lights in the federal inquiry room hummed with a low synthetic buzz that reminded me of the life support scrubbers inside a saturation diving chamber. But the air in here was stale and dry, smelling of expensive cologne, burnt coffee, and institutional fear. I sat at the center of a long mahogany table, a 54-year-old man in a borrowed suit that felt more restrictive than a 300-pound diving rig. Across from me sat a panel of federal investigators, their faces grim, their desks buried under mountains of schematics and legal briefs. To their left sat the legal defense team for Oceanic Vanguard, the corporation I had bled for over the last 2 decades, and right in the middle of that corporate defense wall sat Carter Hayes. Hayes looked exactly the same as he had the day he fired me. He wore a perfectly tailored Navy suit, his silver hair immaculate, his expression radiating a calculated, bored irritation. He wasn't looking at the photographs scattered across the table in front of me. He didn't want to see the twisted, sheared remnants of the Alpha 7 offshore platform leg. And he certainly didn't want to look at the drone shots of the recovery divers pulling the crushed remnants of the hyperbaric living quarters from the seabed. "Mr. Nelson," a voice cut through the silence. I looked up. Lead investigator Grayson Turner leaned forward. He was a man in his early 50s, with eyes like chipped flint and a demeanor that suggested he had zero patience for corporate doublespeak. He tapped a silver pen against the thick file folder. "I know this is difficult," Turner said, his voice steady, carrying the weight of the room. "But for the record, I need you to confirm your employment history with Oceanic Vanguard and your specific role on the Alpha 7 Deepwater project." "John Nelson," I replied. My voice sounded harsh, gravelly from too many years breathing mixed gas under pressure. 32 years as a commercial diver, 19 years in saturation. I was the lead subsea welding inspector for the Alpha 7 jacket installation. "And you were terminated from this position on October 12th, Turner asked. "I was. 14 days before the structural failure that resulted in the catastrophic collapse of the platform leg and the subsequent deaths of 15 offshore workers, including your 6-man saturation diving team." "Yes, sir." Hayes shifted in his chair, whispering something to the shark in a suit sitting next to him. Turner ignored them, his eyes locked on mine. "Mr. Nelson, Oceanic Vanguard has testified that the collapse was due to an unforeseen seismic event, a microtremor that compromised the seabed foundation. They claim the welds were flawless. They claim you were terminated for insubordination and erratic behavior." I reached out and picked up an 8x10 glossy photograph. It showed a massive section of high-strength tubular steel, torn open like a tin can. I stared at the jagged edge of the metal. I could almost hear the groaning of the steel under millions of pounds of load right before it gave way. I thought of the men inside the chamber when the rig tipped, plummeting them into the abyss with no hope of rescue. "There was no seismic event, Mr. Turner," I said, placing the photo down and looking directly at Carter Hayes. Hayes finally met my gaze, his jaw tightening. "The sea didn't kill those men. A spreadsheet killed them. I'm here to tell you exactly how it happened. Saturation diving isn't just a job, it's an exile. When you work at depths of 400 feet, you don't commute to the surface at the end of your shift. The pressure down there would crush your lungs and boil your blood with nitrogen bubbles if you tried. Instead, they lock you inside a pressurized steel tube on the deck of a support ship, pressurize it to match the depth of the ocean floor, and keep you there for weeks. We were living at 12 atmospheres of pressure. The air we breathed was a mixture of helium and oxygen. It made our voices sound high and cartoonish, a cruel joke given the brutal, exhausting nature of the work. You live in a space no bigger than a walk-in closet with 5 other men. You eat, sleep, and breathe in a metal can, completely dependent on the topside crew not to make a mistake that turns your habitat into a coffin. My dive partner was Tommy Campbell. Tommy was 34, built like a linebacker, and possessed an endless, infuriating optimism that I had spent the last 3 weeks trying to chip away at. We were crammed into the diving bell, a claustrophobic sphere hanging suspended in the pitch-black freezing water, waiting for the topside supervisor to give us the green light to lock out. The condensation dripped down the steel bulkheads, pooling around our heavy boots. "You're too tense, Johnny," Tommy said, his voice squeaking through the comms. He was checking the seals on his hot water suit. the only thing that would keep us from freezing to death once we stepped out into the 4 degrees Celsius water. My wife, Sarah, she sent a message up to the supervisor, said the nursery is painted. Seafoam green, we're naming him Leo. Focus on your umbilical, Tommy, I grunted, adjusting my heavy helmet. The ocean doesn't care what color you painted the nursery. If your hot water fails out there, you'll go hypothermic in 4 minutes. Always sunshine and rainbows with you, old man, Tommy laughed, slapping my shoulder. But he double-checked his lines anyway. He knew I was hard on him because I wanted him to go home and meet Leo. Diver 1, Diver 2, you are clear to lock out. The topside supervisor's voice crackled in our earpieces. We dropped out of the bottom of the bell and into the abyss. There is no light at 400 feet. The only illumination came from the powerful halogen lamps mounted on our helmets, cutting narrow beams through the swirling marine snow. We were working on Node 42, the primary junction where the massive diagonal braces met the main vertical leg of the oil platform. This was high-strength, high-tensile steel. It was engineered to withstand the brutal forces of the ocean, but high-strength steel is notoriously temperamental to weld. It requires precise preheating, exact voltage, and immaculate environmental control. The previous shift had completed the multi-pass weld inside a hyperbaric welding habitat, a dry, pressurized box clamped around the pipe. My job was to inspect it. I hauled myself along the structure, my umbilical trailing behind me like a lifeline back to the bell. The sheer scale of the platform leg was terrifying. It was a massive steel pillar disappearing into the dark above and below. If this node failed, the entire structural integrity of the rig would be compromised. "All right, Tommy," I said over the comms, my breathing heavy in the helmet. "Hand me the ultrasonic rig. Let's see what the night shift left us." I didn't know it yet, but I was about to find the flaw that would end Tommy's life. The hyperbaric habitat was cramped and smelled of ozone and burnt flux. We had blown the water out of the box so I could do a dry inspection of the massive circular weld on Node 42. Tommy was hovering outside in the water, keeping my lines clear and acting as my safety. I spent 3 hours meticulously running the ultrasonic transducer over the cooled steel, watching the digital waveforms on my monitor. The weld looked beautiful to the naked eye. The night shift had laid down a cosmetically perfect bead, but in my line of work, cosmetic perfection was often the liar's cloak. I wiped sweat from my forehead, the heavy atmosphere of the habitat pressing against my chest. I moved the transducer to the heat-affected zone area of base metal, right next to the weld that had been heated nearly to melting point and then cooled. The waveform on my screen spiked violently. I stopped breathing. I slowly dragged the probe back over the same millimeter of steel. Again, the spike, a sharp, jagged interruption in the sound wave bouncing through the metal. "Topside, this is Nelson," I keyed my microphone. "Go ahead, Johnny," the supervisor replied. "I've got an anomaly on Node 42, heat-affected zone 6 o'clock position. What kind of anomaly?" I pulled out a magnetic particle inspection kit. I magnetized the steel, sprayed the fluorescent iron particles across the joint, and clicked on my ultraviolet light. Under the eerie purple glow, a faint, jagged line appeared in the steel, barely the width of a human hair. But to my trained eyes, it looked like a lightning bolt. It didn't run along the weld. It ran into the base metal. It was a spiderweb of microscopic devastation. "Hydrogen-induced cracking," I said, my stomach turning to lead. "Transverse, cold cracking." There was a long pause on the radio. "Are you sure, John?" the supervisor asked. "The night shift held preheat parameters perfectly." "I don't care what their logs say," I snapped. "Maybe their electrodes got damp. Maybe the cooling rate was too fast. But I'm looking at underbed cracking and high tensile steel. It's brittle, under load. This thing is going to unzip like a cheap zipper." "Copy that. Stand by." I stared at the glowing green line under the UV light. Hydrogen cracking in this specific grade of steel wasn't just a defect. It was a death sentence for the structure. The hydrogen atoms, introduced during the welding process, migrate into the grain boundaries of the steel. As the metal cools, the hydrogen expands, tearing the metal apart from the inside out. You can't grind it out. You can't just weld over it. You have to cut the entire section out and start over. A delay that would cost millions of dollars. "Johnny," Tommy's voice came through, sounding worried. "How bad is it?" "It's a teardown, Tommy," I said quietly. "We need to recut the joint." The radio crackled again. It wasn't the supervisor this time. It was Carter Hayes, the project director, broadcasting directly from the corporate office on the support ship above. "Nelson, this is Hayes. I'm looking at the night shift's telemetry. The weld parameters were within acceptable tolerance. Wrap up your inspection. We're blowing down the habitat and moving the bell to the next node. I gripped the microphone tightly. Hayes, the weld is compromised. I'm refusing to sign the NDT certification. His joint cannot take the structural load of the jacket. You have 12 hours left in your shift, Nelson. Pass the weld, or I'll find someone who will. We loft back into the saturation living chamber on the deck of the support vessel after our shift. The chamber was a steel cylinder barely 20 feet long and 7 feet wide, pressurized to equivalent depth. It smelled of damp neoprene, body odor, and the sterile tang of scrubbed air. While the other 4 divers slept in their narrow bunks, I sat at the small stainless steel table, writing up my daily inspection report on a specialized waterproof tablet. I didn't mince words. Under the section for Note 42, I flagged it in the system as a Category A critical defect, hydrogen-induced cracking, immediate remediation required. I hit send. It was routed directly to the project engineers and Carter Hayes. 10 minutes later, the comms speaker above the table crackled to life. "John, put your headset on." It was Hayes. His voice didn't have the usual crackle of the deck supervisors. He was calling from the plush, climate-controlled project management suite, 3 decks above us. I slipped the headset over my ears. "I'm here. I'm looking at your report," Hayes said, his tone deceptively calm. "You're calling for a full cut and re-weld of the primary node." "That's right. The base metal is compromised. If we load the jacket onto that leg, the stress concentration will hit that fissure, and it will run the entire length of the joint." "John, do you have any idea what the day rate is for the heavy lift crane barge waiting 30 miles from our position?" Hayes asked. "It's $1 million a day. If we delay to cut and re-weld Note 42, we lose 3 days. That's $3 million, plus penalties for missing our completion window." "I understand the math, Hayes, but the physics don't care about your completion bonus," I replied, keeping my voice low so I wouldn't wake Tommy, who was snoring lightly in the bunk across from me. "The weld is brittle. It will fail. The ultrasonic data from the night shift showed no porosity and no slag inclusions," Hayes countered smoothly. "The structural engineers in Houston signed off on the procedure. You're looking at a microscopic anomaly and calling it a catastrophic failure. It's cold cracking. It happens after the weld cools. The night shift wouldn't have seen it. I saw it. It's there." "Rewrite the report, John," Hayes said. "It wasn't a request. Flag it as a cosmetic surface anomaly. We'll put a reinforced collar around it later if we have to, but the inspection needs to pass today." I looked out the thick, 6-inch acrylic viewport of the chamber. Outside, a deckhand was walking by carrying a tray of hot coffee. We were separated by a few inches of clear plastic, but we were worlds apart. I was living under a pressure that would crush him instantly, and I was being asked to sign off on a lie that would kill everyone in this tin can. "I'm not changing the report," I said. "Send down a secondary inspector if you want. But my name isn't going on a compromised joint." The line went dead. The tension in the chamber the next day was suffocating. We were scheduled to lock out at 0600, but the supervisor kept us on standby. Tommy paced the narrow floor space, aggressively wringing out his dive gloves. "What did you put in that report, Johnny?" Tommy finally asked, his voice tight. "They're holding the bell. The relief crew is whispering over the open comms. They're saying you're trying to halt the whole project." "I found a crack, Tommy. A bad one," I told them quietly. "They want me to ignore it." Tommy ran a hand through his damp hair. "Can't we just put a reinforcement pass over it?" "Look, I need this bonus, John. Sarah's due in a month. If we miss the deadline, they dock our saturation pay by 30%. A reinforcement pass will just introduce more heat, more hydrogen, and more stress," I explained, looking him dead in the eye. "Tommy, I'm not doing this to be difficult. If that leg buckles, it doesn't just damage the rig. The living chambers are mounted on the platform's substructure. If the rig goes down, we go down with it." Before Tommy could answer, a shadow fell across the main viewport. Carter Hayes had come down from the executive deck. He stood in the dimly lit saturation control van, looking in at us through the thick acrylic window. He picked up the external microphone. His voice piped directly into our chamber overhead speaker. "Nelson, come to the glass." I stepped up to the viewport. Hayes was inches away, yet untouchable in his dry, atmospheric pressure world. He held a clipboard in his hand. "I'm giving you one last chance," Hayes said, his eyes cold and flat. "I have the final NDT certification form right here. I just need your verbal authorization to apply your digital signature, and we can all get back to work. If you say yes, I'll even authorize a hazard bonus for the entire dive team for catching the surface anomaly. It was a bribe. A blatant, desperate bribe. A blatant, desperate bribe to keep the timeline moving. I need 24 hours, I said firmly, my voice squeaking slightly due to the helium, but my resolve absolute. We need to perform a thermal stress relief pass, let it cool, and then run a full radiographic inspection. If it passes the X-ray, I'll sign it. At minimum, I need that day. Hayes stared at me through the acrylic. He didn't blink. He just slowly lowered the microphone and tapped his finger against the glass. You're done, Nelson. His voice echoed through the speaker. You are officially terminated for insubordination and obstructing a critical timeline. Pack your personal gear. Tommy stepped up behind me, his face pale. Wait, Mr. Hayes, you can't just fire the lead inspector in the middle of a saturation run. The regulations state that I can replace personnel who refuse to perform their duties. Hayes snapped. Campbell, you're diving with the backup from the B team. Get your gear ready. Hayes looked back at me. Move into the decompression lock, Nelson. We're bleeding you out. My chest tightened. Being fired was one thing. The being forced into decompression meant I was completely removed from the team. I couldn't protect Tommy. I couldn't double-check the backup diver's work. I was being sealed in a separate metal tube and slowly sent back to the surface. Utterly powerless. Hayes, listen to me! I shouted, hitting the thick glass with the heel of my hand. Do not load that jacket! You are going to kill these men. Hayes didn't even flinch. He turned his back and walked out of the control van. I turned to Tommy. He looked terrified. Tommy, I gripped his shoulder. When you get down there, look at the base metal. Don't let them rush you. If you don't like it, you refuse to dive. Promise me. I promise, Johnny, he whispered, looking down at his boots. But I could see the fear of losing his job warring with the fear of the ocean. The corporation had him right where they wanted him. They moved me into the secondary transfer lock, a smaller, even more claustrophobic cylinder attached to the main living chamber. Once the heavy steel hatch was sealed behind me, the technicians began the agonizingly slow process of decompression. When you're saturated at 400 feet, you can't just go back to normal pressure. It takes roughly a day of decompression for every 100 feet of depth. I had a 4-day sentence in solitary confinement ahead of me, bleeding off pressure by a few feet every hour. Through the small internal viewport, I could see the rest of the team in the main chamber. I watched Tommy gearing up with the new Gaia kid in his 20s who looked eager to please and entirely too inexperienced to stand up to Carter Hayes. I sat on my narrow bunk, listening to the comms feed. They hadn't cut my audio access yet, likely out of sheer oversight. I listened as the bell descended. I listened as the new kid locked out and swam to node 42. Looks good to me, topside, the kid's voice chirped over the radio just an hour later. Weld is clean, no visible defects. Copy that, the supervisor replied. No ultrasonic required. Visual inspection passed. Clear the area. We are bringing in the crane barge to begin loading the jacket. I buried my face in my hands. They were skipping the NDT entirely. They were taking the word of a junior diver doing a simple visual sweep over an instrumented inspection. Over the next 3 days, as my chamber pressure slowly ticked downward towards sea level, I felt every vibration of the heavy lift crane moving massive sections of steel onto the platform structure above. Every groan of the ship, every shift in the metal, sounded like a countdown. On my final day of decompression, Tommy walked past my internal viewport. He stopped and looked through the thick glass at me. He looked exhausted, bags under his eyes. He pressed his hand against the glass and offered a weak, forced smile, giving me a thumbs up. I couldn't smile back. I just placed my hand on the glass opposite his. I wanted to break through. I wanted to drag him into my chamber and take him to the surface with me. But the pressure differential between us was a physical wall of steel and physics. I watched him turn away and head back to the bunks, completely oblivious to the ticking time bomb supporting his metal home. The heavy steel hatch of the decompression chamber finally swung open. The air outside tasted thin and artificial, even on the deck of the support ship. I was met immediately by 2 security contractors and dark windbreakers. They didn't speak. They just flanked me, handed me a duffel bag containing my personal effects, and escorted me to a waiting helicopter. I wasn't allowed to say goodbye to the topside crew. I wasn't allowed to grab a cup of coffee in the galley. Carter Hayes was ensuring my removal was swift, silent, and absolute. When the chopper landed at the onshore heliport, I rented a cheap car and drove the 3 hours back to my empty house. My wife had left me 5 years ago. The long deployments and the constant unspoken fear of the ocean had finally hollowed out our marriage. It was just me and an old golden retriever named Barnaby, who greeted me at the door with a wagging tail and a confused whine, wondering why I was home 3 weeks early. I spent the next 24 hours in a state of paralyzing, restless dread. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that jagged green line under the UV light. I saw the massive weight of the platform jacket pressing down on Node 42. I tried to call the mainland office of the Federal Occupational Safety Board. I was transferred 3 times and finally left a rambling, desperate voicemail for an inspector who was out of the office for the weekend. I tried calling the support ship, but my authorization codes had been revoked, and the radio operator hung up the moment he recognized my voice. I was blacklisted, a disgruntled former employee screaming about the sky falling. That's exactly how Hayes would spin it, if anyone ever bothered to ask. I sat in my armchair in the dark, watching the local news on mute, a half-empty glass of cheap whiskey in my hand. The quiet of the house was deafening after weeks of the constant humming roar of the life support machinery. I felt like I was still under pressure, my chest tight, waiting for the crack to propagate. It happened at 2:14 a.m. The phone on the wall in the kitchen rang. It was an old rotary landline I kept for emergencies. The sound was sharp, violent, and utterly terrifying in the silence of the house. I didn't want to answer it. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. I knew before I picked up the receiver. "Hello," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Johnny?" It was Sarah, Tommy's wife. She was sobbing, a ragged, breathless sound that tore right through me. "Johnny, tell me it's not true. Please tell me he's okay." "Sarah." I gripped the counter edge so hard my knuckles turned white. "Sarah, what happened?" "The news," she gasped, her voice breaking completely. "They're saying the Alpha 7. They're saying it collapsed. A structural failure. Johnny, the living chambers were attached to the leg. They said the chambers fell. They fell into the water. The whiskey glass slipped from my fingers and shattered on the linoleum floor. They're organizing a rescue, right?" she pleaded, her voice rising in panic. "They can bring the bell up, right?" My throat closed. The hyperbaric living chambers weren't designed to be dropped into the ocean. They were massive, heavy steel cylinders mounted on the deck structure. If the rig leg collapsed and took the deck with it, the chambers would detach and plummet straight to the bottom. They had no independent buoyancy. They had no independent heating. Even if the hull survived the impact at the bottom, the men inside had perhaps 48 hours of emergency scrubbed air. But without topside hot water, they would freeze to death in a fraction of that time. And Tommy was inside. "Sarah, I'll call you right back," I managed to choke out. I hung up and lunged for my cell phone, frantically dialing the emergency numbers for the Coast Guard and the Offshore Coordination Center. It was chaos. Nobody knew anything for certain, only that a massive geological event had compromised the Alpha 7 structure, leading to a catastrophic collapse of the primary leg. I dropped the phone. The room spun. It wasn't a geological event. It was Node 42. Under the immense newly applied load of the platform jacket, the microscopic hydrogen cracking had run like shattered glass. The high tensile steel had snapped, taking the entire structural support with it. 15 men, including the 6 men trapped in the saturation chamber, sitting in the freezing dark, waiting for a rescue that I knew, with sickening certainty, was physically impossible. The news coverage was relentless and horrifyingly sanitized. Corporate spokespeople for Oceanic Vanguard stood before podiums, looking somber in dark suits, talking about unforeseeable acts of God and unprecedented seismic anomalies. They talked about the bravery of the rescue divers. They didn't talk about the fact that it was a recovery operation, not a rescue. I stood on the pier 3 days later when the salvage vessel returned. A cold, driving rain soaked my clothes, but I didn't feel it. I stood behind the police barricades with the families. Sarah was there, supported by 2 friends, her pregnant belly a cruel reminder of what had been stolen. I watched as the heavy lift crane slowly hoisted the mangled, crushed remains of the saturation living chamber onto the dock. The thick steel hull, designed to withstand the pressure of the deep, had been dented and warped by the impact with the seabed. I knew exactly what it looked like inside. I knew the terror they must have felt as the chamber broke loose and fell. I knew the freezing, suffocating dark that followed. They brought the body bags out one by one. When they brought the second bag out, Sarah let out a wail that I will hear until the day I die. It was a sound of absolute, bottomless despair. I couldn't look at her. I couldn't walk over and comfort her. How could I? I was the inspector. I was the man who was supposed to keep him safe. I knew the weld was bad, and I had let them send me away. A black town car pulled up near the salvage operation, safely behind the police lines. The window rolled down halfway. I saw Carter Hayes sitting in the back seat, speaking into a cell phone, his face an unreadable mask. He didn't look at the body bags. He didn't look at the screaming families. He was already managing the fallout. The knock on my door was sharp and authoritative. I hadn't left the house in nearly 3 weeks, except to buy dog food and cheap groceries at odd hours to avoid the neighbors. I opened the door to find 2 federal marshals standing on my porch. They handed me a thick manila envelope and walked away without a word. Inside was a subpoena to appear before the Federal Investigatory Commission. But it wasn't just a summons to testify. It was attached to a preliminary brief filed by Oceanic Vanguard's legal team. I read the brief sitting at my kitchen table, my blood turning to ice. They weren't just claiming a freak geological event anymore. They were building a secondary narrative. They claimed that as the lead inspector, I had become increasingly erratic and paranoid in the days leading up to the collapse. They documented my insubordination. And most damning of all, they stated that I had ultimately approved the weld on Node 42 before being removed from the site for disciplinary reasons. They were setting me up to take the fall. If the geological defense didn't hold up in court, they were going to say the weld failed because I failed to inspect it properly, signed off on it, and then suffered a mental breakdown. The next morning, my phone rang. It was an unfamiliar Washington, D.C. number. John Nelson? The voice was gravelly and direct. Who is this? My name is Grayson Turner. I'm the lead investigator for the Federal Commission looking into the Alpha 7 collapse. Your deposition is scheduled for the 22nd of next month. I suggest you bring everything you have. They wiped my access, Turner, I said, anger finally piercing through the numb haze of grief. I submitted a category A critical defect report. I flagged the hydrogen cracking, but I can't access the system to prove it. I know, Turner replied calmly. Oceanic Vanguard provided us with the server logs. Your report isn't in there. They provided a clean bill of health for Node 42, with your digital signature on it. I stopped breathing. That's a lie. I never signed it. Hayes fired me because I refused to sign it. Then you better figure out how to prove that, Mr. Nilsson. Because right now you are the last man holding the pen before 15 men died. The line clicked dead. Which brings us back to the sterile, buzzing lights of the federal inquiry room. I sat across from Grayson Turner, the photographs of the twisted steel, and the body bags scattered between us. Carter Hayes sat with his legal team, radiating a smug, untouchable confidence. He had millions of dollars and corporate defense lawyers insulating him. I just had the truth, and a very specific knowledge of hyperbaric physics. Mr. Nelson, Turner said, holding up a laminated document. I am showing you Exhibit F14. It is the final non-destructive testing certification for Node 42. It authorizes the heavy lift crane to apply the platform jacket to the leg structure. Do you recognize this document? I recognize the form, I said, my voice steady. I do not recognize the authorization. Your digital signature and unique employee identification number are stamped at the bottom, the lead corporate lawyer interrupted smoothly. Are you claiming someone else guessed your biometric PIN and authorized this? I'm claiming I didn't sign it. I looked directly at Carter Hayes. I found a micro fissure. I refused to sign. Mr. Hayes terminated me and sent me to the decompression lock. Hayes let out a practiced, weary sigh. Mr. Nelson was highly stressed. It's common for saturation divers to suffer memory fragmentation during psychological episodes. Turner leaned forward, staring at me. Mr. Nelson, the digital timestamp on this signature is October 12th at 14:30 hours. Oceanic Vanguard server logs confirm the signature was generated from the saturation control terminal on the deck of the support ship. Can you prove you did not sign this? I looked at the timestamp. Then I looked at Hayes. The faintest crack appeared in his confident veneer. He had made a mistake. A bureaucratic, arrogant mistake made by a man who didn't respect the technical reality of the world he managed. Mr. Turner, I said, leaning into the microphone, could you please cross-reference that timestamp with the ship's decompression logs for the secondary transfer lock? Turner frowned, flipping through a massive binder. He found the page. Okay, I have the decompression logs. What was the chamber pressure of the secondary lock at exactly 14:30 hours on October 12th? I asked. Turner traced his finger down the page. 280 feet of seawater equivalent. And where is the saturation control terminal located? I asked. And the topside control van, Turner replied, his eyes suddenly narrowing as he connected the dots. At sea level atmospheric pressure. At 14:30 hours, I was sealed inside a steel decompression chamber at a pressure of nearly 9 atmospheres, I said, my voice ringing out in the quiet room. If I had opened the hatch to walk into the control van and sign that document, my blood would have boiled instantly, and I would have exploded. It is physically, scientifically impossible for me to have signed that certification. The silence in the room was absolute. The corporate lawyer beside Hayes suddenly went pale. He hurriedly began flipping through his own copies of the logs. Hayes sat frozen, the blood draining from his face. He had used my ID number to force the paperwork through the system, but he hadn't bothered to check my exact decompression schedule when he forged the timestamp. Furthermore, I continued, pressing the advantage. The internal chamber cameras record 24/7 for safety monitoring. Pull the tape from the secondary lock for that day. You will see me sitting on my bunk, locked inside at the exact moment my signature was applied to that death warrant. Grayson Turner slowly put the document down. He didn't look at me. He looked at Carter Hayes. The flint in the investigator's eyes had turned into cold steel. "Mr. Hayes," Turner said, his voice dropping an octave, "I am advising you to retain personal, independent criminal counsel immediately." The ocean was rough today, churning with gray caps under a heavy, overcast sky. I stood on the bluff overlooking the bay, my hands deep in my coat pockets. 6 months had passed since the deposition. The federal investigation had moved with uncharacteristic speed once the forgery was exposed. Carter Hayes' corporate shield shattered the moment criminal fraud and negligence were proven. Oceanic Vanguard threw him to the wolves to save their own stock price. Hayes was indicted on 15 counts of federal manslaughter. He was currently sitting in a holding cell, denied bail, awaiting trial. The corporation was hit with record-breaking fines and a complete shutdown of their offshore operations pending a global safety review. It was a victory. The news channels called it a triumph for the working man. But standing here, listening to the waves crash against the rocks, it didn't feel like a victory. You can put a man in a cage, but it doesn't pull a crushed steel tube off the bottom of the sea. A few feet away stood a newly erected bronze memorial, 15 names etched into dark stone. I walked over and traced my fingers over the letters. Tommy Campbell. Sarah had given birth to a healthy baby boy 2 months ago. She named him Leo, just like Tommy wanted. I had set up a quiet trust fund for him, quietly draining my life savings and the settlement money from Oceanic Vanguard. It was the only thing I could think to do. I looked out at the vast, uncaring expanse of the water. For 32 years, that ocean had been my entire life. It had been my purpose, my challenge, and my home. But looking at it now, all I saw was a graveyard. I turned my back on the water, whistled for Barnaby, and walked to my truck. I wasn't going back down, not ever again.